The sun in the Arizona territory doesn't just shine, it attacks. It's a physical weight, a white-hot hammer that beats down from a bleached-out sky, trying to grind you into the red dust you walk on. Lucinda Ward felt it pressing on her shoulders, on the brim of her hat, on the very last nerve she had left. She pulled the mule's lead rope, the coarse fiber digging into her palm. The grit was everywhere, in her teeth, in the folds of her dress, in the dry crack of her lips. Each step was a tiny explosion of red earth, a puff of a world that wanted nothing more than for her to turn back and disappear. 10 steps behind, her nephew Tommy dragged his feet. He was 10 years old, and the desert had already stolen the boyish bounce from his step, replacing it with the stubborn, leaden shuffle of survival. The hat she'd bought him in Ash Fork, meant to protect him, now looked like it was trying to swallow him whole, its brim flopping over his eyes. His canteen slapped against his hip with a hollow, sloshing sound that was more a reminder of what they were losing than what they had. "Not much farther," she called back, her voice raspy, the lie tasting like dust in her mouth. How could she know? The map was a fool's dream, sketched on a napkin by a man in a saloon whose eyes had darted everywhere but at her. Painted Canyon, he'd called it, just beyond the next bend. A place of stories carved into stone, left by the Apache people centuries before a single railroad tie was ever laid on this earth. She'd come all this way, dragging this poor boy with her, chasing a ghost, her father's ghost. Tommy trudged up beside her, his face flushed a dangerous red under his freckles. "Are they really there, Aunt Lucy? The paintings?" She tried to smile, but it felt like cracking plaster. "Stone doesn't forget, Tommy. Not like people do." She said it for him, but she was thinking of her father. Had the stone forgotten him? That's when she heard it, a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't the whisper of the wind or the skitter of a lizard. It was sharp, metallic, a cruel clang of iron striking rock, followed by the low, guttural murmur of men's voices. These were not the sounds of discovery. They were the sounds of theft. Instinct, cold and sharp, seized her. She grabbed Tommy's arm, her fingers digging in, and pulled him hard against the canyon wall, into a sliver of shade that felt more like a tomb than a refuge. "Stay here," she whispered, her voice a thread. "Don't make a sound." She crept forward, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Peeking around the massive curve of red rock was like looking into hell's workshop. 3 men stood at the base of the cliff, their backs to her. One of them, a brute with shoulders like a bull, was prying at the wall with a crowbar. He wasn't just chipping. He was carving out entire sections of the painted rock, the sacred images splintering and falling like broken pottery. Another man, thin and wiry, held a rifle, his eyes constantly scanning the wash. The third knelt over a heavy canvas sack, stuffing the desecrated pieces inside. Rage, pure and hot, burned through her fear. They were killing the stories, tearing pages from a book that could never be reprinted. They were stealing history, stealing souls for what? A few dollars from some collector back east? Tommy, right behind her, shifted his weight. His boot scraped against a piece of loose shale. It was a small sound, a tiny clack. But in the vast silence of the canyon, it was as loud as a gunshot. All 3 men spun around in unison, their movements jagged and predatory. The rifleman's eyes locked onto them. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face, a gash in his sun-blasted skin. "Well now," he drawled, the sound slithering through the air. "Look what the wind blew in." Lucinda straightened up, pushing Tommy behind her skirt. Her mind was a blank slate of terror, but she forced her voice to be steady. "We're just passing through," she said, the words feeling pathetic and small. "We don't want any trouble." The man with the crowbar laughed, a short, ugly bark. He took a step toward them, the heavy iron bar held like a club. "Trouble ain't something you get to choose out here, lady. Out here, trouble chooses you." He took another step, his shadow falling over them like a shroud. This was it. This was how it ended, chasing a ghost into a shallow grave. But then a voice drifted down from above. It was calm, steady, and laced with a dry amusement that was more chilling than any threat. "3 grown men robbing a cliff," the voice said, each word perfectly clear. and not a single one of you thought to look up. The looters froze solid, their heads snapping upward as if pulled by strings. And Lucinda looked up too. On a ledge 20 feet above them, a man stood silhouetted against the blinding sky. He was lean, long-limbed, with hair as black as a raven's wing tied back from his face. A simple band of red cloth was knotted around his brow. In his hands he held a bow. It was no simple hunting weapon. It was long and powerful, and the string was drawn back. An arrow knocked and aimed directly at the heart of the man with the crowbar. The arrowhead glinted, a single deadly star in the oppressive daylight. The rifleman's face twisted into a snarl of recognition and hatred. "Victorio!" He spat the name like a curse. The man on the ledge didn't move a muscle. Lucinda didn't know the name, but she saw the fear that flickered in the looter's eyes. This wasn't just a man. He was a reckoning. The rifleman hitched his weapon higher. "This ain't your land, Victorio." A faint, dangerous smile touched the archer's lips. "It isn't yours either," he said, his voice still unnervingly calm. "Drop the sack. Leave the way you came. And maybe the canyon will let you walk out of here alive." The crowbar man let out a disbelieving snort. "Or what? You gonna shoot one of us?" "There's 3 of us, Apache. You can't get us all." There was no sound, no warning, just the whisper of the bowstring. The arrow blurred through the air and thudded deep into the sand, precisely between the man's boots. It stood there quivering, a perfect, deadly exclamation point. The archer's voice was as soft as falling dust. "That was a warning. The next one won't be." A silent, frantic conversation passed between the 3 looters. The man with the sack muttered a string of curses, then threw the heavy bag to the ground with a thud of finality. They started backing away, their eyes still locked on the figure on the ledge, their retreat clumsy and full of hate. They vanished around the bend, and only when the sound of their crunching boots had completely faded did Lucinda dare to breathe. The man called Victorio descended from the ledge with the fluid grace of a mountain lion, his moccasins making no sound on the rock. He landed on the canyon floor, and his eyes, dark and intense, swept over her, then to Tommy and then back again, lingering. They weren't angry eyes or kind eyes. They were judging eyes, weighing her, measuring her, seeing right through the flimsy story she told herself. "You picked a fine day to step into other people's messes," he said. His tone was flat, but the dry humor was still there, as if this whole life-or-death encounter was nothing more than a minor interruption to his day. Lucinda found her voice, trying to reclaim some shred of dignity. "We weren't looking for a mess. My name is Lucinda Ward. I've come from back east. I'm here to study the paintings." His eyes narrowed, just a fraction, but it was enough to make her feel like a complete fool. "I know who you are," he said, and the words hit her like a physical blow. How could he possibly know? Word travels fast when a woman with a child's sketchbook and a desperate look in her eyes comes asking questions in Ash Fork. He glanced down at the bag she carried, the one with her pencils, her paper, and her father's hidden journal. Her heart hammered against her ribs. He couldn't know about that. He couldn't. "I'm here to document them," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. "Not to steal them." His gaze flickered to Tommy, who was staring at him with wide-eyed awe. "My nephew," she added quickly. "Thomas." Tommy, forgetting all fear, stepped forward. "You hit that spot. You aimed for it, and you hit it right between his feet." For the first time, the barest hint of a smile touched Deucen's mouth. "Missing," he said, his voice low, "is the hard part." He looked back at Lucinda, his expression turning serious again. "Those men, they'll be back." "I know," she said, a shiver running down her spine despite the heat. "And you being here," he continued, his gaze unwavering, "gives them another reason to. Outsiders draw more outsiders, like flies to a corpse." The words were harsh, a clear warning. He wanted her gone. It was a test. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze. She had come too far, sacrificed too much to be scared away now. "I'm not leaving." He studied her for a long, silent moment. She expected him to argue, to threaten, to order her out of his canyon. Instead, he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "Suit yourself," he said, turning away. "But if you're staying, you're not sleeping in the open for them to find." Follow me. He started walking, not looking back to see if she obeyed. Lucinda hesitated. Following him meant trusting him, a man who appeared from the rocks like a spirit, who knew her name when he shouldn't, who looked at her like he could see every secret she carried. But then Tommy's small, trusting hand slipped into hers, warm and real, and that decided it. She squeezed his hand and followed the stranger deeper into the heart of the canyon, leaving the desecrated wall and the spilled sack of stories behind them. The feeling of being watched, not by the man in front of her, but by the canyon itself, prickled at the back of her neck. She had come looking for her father's past and had stumbled into a war she didn't understand, led by a man who already knew more about her than she knew about herself. The path he led them on was less a trail and more a scar etched into the vertical face of the canyon wall. It was steep and treacherous, the red rock hot against their palms as they scrambled upwards. Lucinda's city-worn boots slipped on the loose scree, and more than once, she felt the terrifying emptiness of the air just inches from her heels. But Dusan moved ahead of them with an impossible, silent grace, a phantom in his own home. Tommy, surprisingly, seemed to find a new energy, his fear replaced by a boy's fascination with the climb, his hands and feet finding holds as if by instinct. Just when Lucinda thought her lungs would burst, the world opened up. The narrow track led them onto a hidden plateau, a perfect circle of flat ground, completely enclosed by towering walls of sandstone, invisible from the wash below. It was a secret room carved by wind and time. In the center sat a small, blackened fire pit, and beside it, a lean-to shelter made from willow branches and a weathered piece of canvas. It was a home. "Is this yours?" Lucinda asked, her voice breathless from the climb and the stark beauty of the place. "For now," Dusan said, crouching to inspect the ashes in the fire pit. He sifted them through his fingers. "Cold. Good. No one's been here since I left this morning." His words hung in the air. He hadn't just been passing by when he found them. He had been watching, waiting. Tommy, ever the explorer, immediately walked to the edge of the hollow, peering down at the canyon floor far below. "You can see everything from here," he exclaimed. "That's the idea," Dusan replied, his eyes scanning the distance. "Trouble has a harder time sneaking up when you see it coming from a mile away." Lucinda let her heavy pack slide from her shoulders. A wave of exhaustion, so profound it was dizzying, washed over her. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling inadequate. "For what you did down there." Dusan's expression remained unreadable, carved from the same stone as the canyon around them. He straightened up and picked up the heavy canvas sack of stolen rock fragments, which he must have retrieved after they started climbing. He handled it with a strange reverence, as if it held the bones of an ancestor. "You want to thank me?" he said, his dark eyes fixing on hers. "Don't touch the stones. Don't sketch them. Don't even breathe on them too hard. They aren't pictures. They're voices. And when you break them, you silence them forever." The intensity in his voice startled her. It wasn't a warning. It was a sacred command. "I understand," she said quietly. "We'll see," he replied, a hint of skepticism in his tone. He slung the sack over his shoulder. "There's a spring nearby. You'll need water if you're staying the night. And if those men decide to come back sooner than I think, you'll need to know where to hide when this place is no longer safe." Tommy's head popped up. "You'll teach us?" he asked, his voice filled with a hopeful excitement that pained Lucinda's heart. Dusan glanced at the boy, and for a fleeting moment, the hard lines of his face softened. One dark eyebrow lifted in challenge. "Maybe, if you can learn to walk without sounding like a rock slide." Tommy grinned, a wide, honest grin that transformed his grimy face. He looked at Dusan not as a savior, but as a teacher, a figure of impossible power and knowledge. Lucinda watched the two of them, and a strange, unfamiliar feeling settled in her chest. She had come to Arizona chasing a dead man's obsession, a quest that had felt lonely and selfish from the moment she'd stepped on the train. But now, standing in this hidden fortress of rock, she realized her solitary journey was over. Her fate, and Tommy's, was now tangled up with this man, this guardian of silent voices, who had decided, for reasons she couldn't begin to fathom, to protect them. As he turned to lead them toward the spring, He paused and looked back at her. His gaze dropped to her satchel, the one containing her father's journal. "That book you carry," he said, his voice low and devoid of any accusation. "The one with the leather cover and the broken clasp. My father knew the man who wrote it. He told me he was a good man, a foolish one, but a good one." The blood drained from Lucinda's face. Her carefully constructed facade, the lie of the disinterested scholar, shattered into a million pieces. He knew. He had known all along. He knew she was Henry Ward's daughter, and he knew her father had died somewhere in these canyons, chasing the same fever dream of painted walls and hidden gold that had nearly gotten her and Tommy killed today. The world tilted on its axis. He wasn't just a random protector. His story and her story were already connected, tied together by the ghosts of their fathers, and he had just let her know, in no uncertain terms, that he was now in control of the narrative. The revelation hung between them, heavy and suffocating in the thin desert air. Lucinda's carefully crafted identity as a simple academic lay in ruins at her feet. He knew she was a liar. He knew she was chasing her father's obsession. The man on the napkin in Ashfork hadn't just given her directions. He'd described her, her nephew, and the desperate hunger in her eyes to Dusan's people. They had been watching her since she arrived. She wasn't a visitor. She was an intrusion they had been tracking. "My father," she started, her voice a hoarse whisper, but the words died in her throat. What could she say? Admit she was a fraud? Plead her case? Dusan simply nodded, his face impassive. He wasn't angry. He was waiting. "Your father was looking for gold," he stated, not as a question, but as a fact. He believed the stories on these walls were a map. He was wrong. He died for that mistake. The bluntness of his words was like a slap. He was a dreamer, she defended weakly, the old familiar ache of loss twisting in her gut. "This land doesn't care for dreams," Dusan replied, his voice flat. "It only cares for respect." He showed it none. He saw these walls as a puzzle to be solved for profit. That is why the canyon took him. He turned and started walking again, the conversation for him clearly over. Lucinda stood frozen for a moment, the weight of his knowledge pressing down on her. He had stripped away her pretenses, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. Yet he hadn't sent her away. He was still leading her to water. It was a paradox she couldn't understand. The spring was a miracle, a thin trickle of crystal-clear water weeping from a fissure in the rock, hidden behind a thick curtain of mesquite. It was cool and dark and alive. As she knelt to fill their canteens, the biting cold of the water on her fingers seemed to shock her back to her senses. He held all the cards. Her only choice was to play the hand she was dealt. They returned to the hollow as dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the sky. The air cooled rapidly and the silence deepened, broken only by the chirping of unseen insects. Dusan built a fire with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing, using a handful of kindling to coax a bright, smokeless flame. They ate a simple meal, jerked venison from his pack, and the last of her flatbread, warmed on a rock by the fire. Tommy, seemingly oblivious to the crushing tension between the adults, was completely captivated. He peppered Dusan with questions about the canyon, about tracking, about the bow. Dusan answered him with a surprising patience, his voice losing some of its hard edge when he spoke to the boy. He told a story, not from the walls but from his own memory, of a coyote that had learned to steal jerky from his camp by rolling rocks down a slope as a distraction. "Is that a true story?" Tommy asked, his eyes wide. Dusan looked into the fire. "All stories are true," he said softly, "especially the ones that teach you to watch your back." Later, after Tommy had finally succumbed to exhaustion and was curled under a blanket near the fire, a small sleeping bundle, Lucinda knew she couldn't let the silence fester. She sat across the fire from Dusan, the flames dancing between them, casting flickering shadows on his stoic face. He was checking his bowstring, his long fingers moving with practiced familiarity. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, the question blunt. "If you know I'm here for the same wrong reasons as my father, why not just send me away? Why protect me from those men?" He looked up from his bow, his eyes meeting hers across the flames. The firelight glinted in their dark depths. And for the first time, she saw something beyond the guardian, beyond the warrior. She saw a flicker of profound weariness. Because those men are worse, he said simply. Your father was a fool, but he was one man, driven by a personal ghost. Men like Silas, the one with the rifle, they are a disease. They don't just want to solve the puzzle. They want to tear the book to pieces and sell the scraps. They would burn the whole canyon to the ground to find 1 ounce of gold. You? You are just misguided. You can still learn. His words, a strange mixture of insult and hope, struck a chord deep inside her. He didn't see her as an enemy. He saw her as ignorant. It was a subtle but crucial difference. And what if I don't want to learn? So she challenged, a spark of her old pride returning. What if I still believe my father was right? That there's something here? He leaned forward slightly, the firelight carving deep lines around his eyes. Then you will end up just like him, he said, his voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. And I will not be able to stop the canyon from taking you too. But the boy deserves a chance to walk out of here. That is why I am helping you. For him, not for you or for the ghost of your father. The honesty of his statement was brutal, but it was also a foundation, a place to start. He had drawn a line in the sand. He was protecting Tommy. She was just the baggage that came with him. It stung, but it also clarified everything. As long as she had Tommy, she had Dusan's protection. Those men, he said, changing the subject, his gaze shifting to the darkness beyond their hollow. Silas and his crew. They've set up camp a mile down the wash. I saw their smoke before sunset. They're not leaving. They'll wait, and they'll try again. Probably at first light. A cold dread washed over Lucinda. How can you be so sure? Because I stole something from them, he said. He reached into the canvas sack beside him and pulled out a single fractured piece of sandstone. On it was a painting, not of an animal or a hunter, but of a symbol she recognized instantly from her father's journal. A spiral with 3 lines radiating from it, the symbol her father had believed was the key. This piece doesn't belong with the others, Dusan said. It's from a different wall, a different time. It's what they're really after. And now I have it. He hadn't just saved them. He had deliberately escalated the conflict. He had taken the prize, painting a target on all their backs. The hollow, which had felt like a sanctuary moments before, now felt like a cage. They were trapped on high ground, with a piece of rock that could get them all killed. Dusan hadn't just offered them shelter. He had recruited them into his war. Lucinda stared at the painted stone in his hand. It was the key, the very symbol that had driven her father to madness and death. Her entire life, she had believed it was a map to treasure. But Dusan had called her father a fool. What if the symbol didn't mean what she thought it did? What if her father's entire quest, and by extension her own, was built on a catastrophic misunderstanding? What is it? She whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackle of the fire. What does it really mean? Dusan looked from the stone to her, his expression unreadable. It means you know even less than I thought, he said. He carefully wrapped the stone fragment in a piece of soft hide and tucked it away. Get some sleep. You'll need it. When they come, they won't be polite. He rose and moved to the edge of the hollow, a silent sentinel taking his post against the vast, star-dusted darkness. Sleep was impossible. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. Every shadow seemed to twist into the shape of a man with a rifle. Lucinda lay wrapped in her blanket, the hard ground unforgiving beneath her, her mind racing. Dusan had thrown a gauntlet down, not just to Silas and his men, but to her. He had dismissed her life's purpose as a fool's errand, and then made himself the arbiter of her and Tommy's survival. He wasn't a guide. He was a gatekeeper, and he held the key to everything, the canyon's secrets, her father's failure, and their only path out of this deadly standoff. Morning arrived not with a gentle dawn, but with a hard, aggressive light that turned the edges of the rock to razors. Dusan was already awake, or perhaps he had never slept. He stood on the ledge as still as a statue, watching the canyon floor. Lucinda rose, her body stiff and sore, and went to stand near him. The air was cold and thin. Anything? She asked. They're moving, he said without turning. Not towards us. They're splitting up, fanning out. Silas is smart. He knows he can't come up the same way twice. He's looking for another way to this hollow. His voice was calm, but there was a new tension in it, a tightly coiled spring of readiness. He turned to face her, his eyes dark and serious. Today, you and the boy will learn. There is no more time for sketches and stories. There is only staying alive. The day became a blur of harsh lessons. He was a demanding, relentless teacher. He took them to the hidden spring and showed them two other ways out of the hollow, narrow crevices in the rock that a person could barely squeeze through. Paths that would be invisible to anyone who wasn't shown them. If I fall, he told them, his voice leaving no room for argument, you take these paths. You do not stop until you reach the river. You follow it west. You do not look back. He taught Tommy how to use a sling he fashioned from a strip of leather and sinew, not as a toy, but as a tool. You're not fighting men, he instructed the boy, his tone firm but not unkind. You're making noise. A rock hitting stone from an unexpected place can make a man think there are more of us than there are. It can buy us time. Time is more valuable than bullets. He showed Lucinda which plants were safe to eat and which would kill you. He taught her how to read the tracks in the dust, the clean slice of a deer's hoof, the messy scuff of a man's boot. She was a quick study, her mind so used to academic rigor, latching onto these tangible, vital details. She was learning the language of the canyon, a language far older and more important than the one she had come to study. During one of these lessons, as she knelt to examine a set of coyote tracks, she became aware of Deucen watching her, his gaze intense. You learn fast, he said. It was not a compliment, but an observation. I have a good reason to, she replied, not looking up from the tracks. Your father never learned, he said quietly. He never stopped to look down at the ground he was walking on. He only ever looked at the walls, at his map. He missed everything that was real. The criticism of her father still stung, but it was now tempered by the undeniable truth of her own experience. In just one day, she had learned more about this place than her father had in years of obsessive study. She looked up at him, a question burning in her eyes. The symbol, the one on the stone you took. My father believed it marked the entrance to a mine, a Spanish gold mine. Deucen's mouth twisted in a humorless smile. There are many stories about this canyon. The Spanish story is one of them. It is a good story. It has kept fools busy for generations. He paused, his gaze sweeping the vast, silent landscape around them. There is a treasure in this canyon, but it is not gold. Before she could ask more, his body went rigid. He held up a hand for silence, his head cocked, listening. Lucinda heard nothing but the wind. What is it? She whispered. Get back to the hollow, he ordered, his voice a low hiss. Now, move quietly. He didn't follow them. Instead, he melted back into the rocks, his bow in his hand, moving in the opposite direction. Lucinda's heart hammered as she and Tommy scrambled back up the path. They reached the safety of their hidden camp, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Tommy looked at her, his eyes wide with fear. What's happening? I don't know, she said, pulling him close. We do what he said. We stay low and we stay quiet. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The silence from the canyon below was more terrifying than any noise. Where had Deucen gone? What had he heard? Then a sound shattered the stillness. A single rifle shot, cracking through the air, echoing off the canyon walls like a thunderclap. It came from the south, from the direction Deucen had gone. Lucinda's blood ran cold. Tommy let out a small, choked cry. She held him tighter, her own fear a suffocating weight in her chest. Had they found him? Had Silas's men cornered him alone? Another shot rang out, closer this time. Then a third, followed by a man's yell, a cry of pain and anger that was abruptly cut off. And then silence. A profound, terrifying silence that seemed to swallow all life. They waited, crouched behind the rocks of the fire pit, every muscle tensed. The sun beat down, indifferent. The canyon held its breath. He could be dead. The thought was a shard of ice in her gut. The man who had mocked her, taught her, protected her, could be lying broken on the rocks below, all because he had taken a piece of stone to protect a place she had come to plunder. The irony was a bitter poison. Just as the despair began to solidify into a certainty, she saw movement at the edge of the hollow. Dusan appeared, seemingly out of nowhere, climbing over the rim with the same silent grace as always. He was breathing heavily, and there was a dark, bloody gash on his forearm, but he was alive. He held his bow in one hand, and in the other he carried a rifle that Lucinda recognized. It was the one the wiry man had been holding. "They found one of the back paths," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. He tossed the captured rifle to the ground. "There were two of them. They won't be finding any more paths." The finality in his voice sent a shiver down her spine. He had not just fought them off. He had done more. She didn't ask. She didn't want to know. "You're hurt," she said, gesturing to his arm. "It's nothing," he dismissed, but she saw the pain flicker in his eyes. Without a word, she went to her pack and pulled out the small medical kit she always carried. Bandages, antiseptic, the tools of a civilized world that felt a million miles away. He watched her, a strange expression on his face, as she cleaned and bandaged the wound. His skin was warm under her fingers. For a moment, in that small, intimate act of care, the warrior was gone, and there was only a man, bleeding and weary. "They know where we are now," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "They'll come in force. Silas won't send scouts next time. He'll send everyone." "Then we leave," she said, her voice urgent. "We use the escape paths you showed us. We run." He shook his head, his gaze fixed on the canyon beyond their sanctuary. "No, running is what he wants. He would track us. He would hunt us down in the open. Here," he said, his eyes sweeping their stone fortress. "We have the high ground. Here, the canyon fights with us." He looked at her, his eyes locking with hers. The weariness was gone, replaced by a hard, unyielding resolve. "This is where we make our stand. Your father came looking for a story of gold. Instead, you have found a story of blood and stone. The question is, how do you want this story to end?" The question hung in the air, a direct challenge. He wasn't just asking about survival. He was asking who she was. Was she her father's daughter, the foolish treasure hunter? Or was she someone new forged in the crucible of this canyon? He had saved her, taught her, and now he was asking her to fight alongside him. Not for Tommy's sake, for her own. The line he had drawn between them had vanished. They were in this together. She looked from the captured rifle on the ground to the determined set of Dusan's jaw, and then to Tommy, who was watching them with an expression of terrified hope. Her father's ghost, the obsession that had driven her across a continent, seemed to fade, becoming thin and transparent, like a story that had lost its meaning. A new story was being written right here, in this fortress of rock, and she was a part of it. "They won't take this place," she said, her voice quiet but firm, a promise to him and to herself. "We won't let them." A flicker of something, respect, surprise, maybe something more, passed through Dusan's dark eyes. He gave a single sharp nod. The decision was made. The sun began its slow descent, painting the canyon walls in hues of blood and fire. The time for lessons was over. The time for war was about to begin. They were no longer hiding. They were waiting. The afternoon was a quiet frenzy of preparation. There was no wasted motion, no unnecessary talk. Dusan, despite the throbbing in his arm, moved with a grim purpose that was both inspiring and terrifying. He took Lucinda and Tommy along the rim of the hollow, showing them exactly what needed to be done. His plan was not to build a fortress, but to turn the canyon itself into a weapon. He showed them where to balance large, flat stones on the edge of the cliffs overlooking the main approach. They weren't meant to be a rock slide, not yet. They were meant to be an obstacle course. "A man climbing," he explained, his voice a low murmur, "is watching his hands and feet. He is not watching the sky. A single rock, the size of a fist, is enough to break his concentration. A broken concentration leads to a fall." Under his direction, Tommy, armed with his sling, became a key part of the defense. Dusan placed him in a small protected nook high on the rim, a crow's nest with a perfect view of the goat trail. Your job is not to hit them, Dusan instructed, placing a hand on the boy's small shoulder. Your job is to make them look up. When they look up, they are blind to what is in front of them. He was turning the boy's perceived weakness, his size, into a strategic advantage. To Lucinda, he gave a different task. He led her to one of the narrow escape crevices, a crack in the rock barely wide enough for a person to pass through. At the top of the passage, precariously balanced, was a massive chalkstone, a boulder the size of a horse, wedged between the two walls of the crevice. This, Dusan said, pointing to the smaller rocks and bits of wood shoring up the giant stone, is our final answer. If they break through our defenses on the main trail, they will try to flank us through here. This is the only other way up for a group of men. He showed her the key support, a single thick log wedged beneath the chalkstone. If I tell you it is time, you will come here with the crowbar we found. You will knock this log free. Do you understand? Lucinda stared at the massive boulder hanging over the narrow pass. The sheer destructive power held in balance by that single piece of wood was staggering. It would kill them, she whispered, horrified. Dusan's face was grim. Yes, he said without a trace of hesitation. That is the point. They have chosen this path. They have chosen this fight. We will give them the ending they deserve. He was forcing her to confront the brutal reality of their situation. This wasn't a game of warnings and posturing anymore. It was a fight to the death. As the sun touched the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the canyon, they gathered back in the hollow. The air was thick with unspoken fear and anticipation. Dusan checked his bow, his movements economical and precise. He handed Lucinda the captured rifle. Do you know how to use this? She shook her head. My father tried to teach me once. I didn't want to learn. Learn now, he said, his voice flat. He quickly showed her the mechanism, how to load, how to aim, how to fire. The weapon felt alien and heavy in her hands, a piece of cold, brutal machinery. Aim for the chest. Don't try to be a hero. Your only job is to make them keep their heads down. They ate a cold meal, no one having the appetite for more. As full darkness enveloped the canyon, a profound silence fell. It was the silence of a world holding its breath. Dusan took his position at the main ledge, a specter against the star-dusted sky. Lucinda sat with Tommy near the fire pit, though they didn't light a fire. The rifle lay across her lap, its weight a constant, terrifying reminder of what was coming. Aunt Lucy, Tommy whispered, his voice trembling slightly in the dark. Are we going to die? Lucinda pulled him into a hug, her own heart a frantic bird trapped in her chest. She searched for words of comfort, for a lie that would soothe him, but none came. Instead, she found herself repeating the words Dusan had said, words that had begun to feel like a creed. We have the high ground, she whispered into his hair. Here, the canyon fights with us. Hours passed. The moon, a pale sliver, rose over the canyon rim. The rocks, still holding the day's heat, began to cool, ticking and groaning around them. Every sound was magnified, every gust of wind a potential enemy. Lucinda's nerves were stretched to the breaking point. The waiting was a unique form of torture. Then a signal, a single low whistle from Tommy's position above. It wasn't the call of a night bird. It was the alert Dusan had taught him. They were here. Lucinda's blood turned to ice. She grabbed the rifle, her knuckles white, and crept to the edge of the hollow, her heart pounding a deafening rhythm in her ears. Peering over the ledge, she saw them. Figures moving like wraiths in the moonlight at the base of the goat trail. Not 2 or 3, 6 of them. Silas was at the front, the rifleman, his form unmistakable even in the gloom. They were moving slowly, cautiously, testing each footstep. Dusan materialized beside her, a shadow detaching itself from other shadows. He didn't speak. He simply knocked an arrow, his movements unnervingly calm. This was his world, his battle. Silas gave a hand signal, and 2 of his men started up the trail. They moved in a low crouch, rifles held at the ready. The canyon was silent, watching them come. Lucinda held her breath, the rifle sight wavering in her unsteady hands. From high above, a stone whistled through the air, striking the rock face just inches from the lead climber's head. It wasn't a threat, it was an announcement. "We see you." The man swore, flattening himself against the rock, his eyes scanning the cliffs above. That was the moment Dusan had been waiting for. With the man distracted, looking up, Dusan's bow sang. The arrow streaked through the night and slammed into the climber's thigh with a sickening thump. The man screamed, a high, piercing sound that was abruptly cut off as he lost his footing and tumbled backward, taking the man below him down in a tangle of limbs and curses. A fusillade of rifle fire erupted from the canyon floor, bullets sparking and whining off the rocks around them. "Down!" Dusan yelled, pulling Lucinda back from the ledge. The air was filled with the roar of guns and the ricochet of lead. They were pinned. "They can't hit us from there," Dusan shouted over the din. "They're just giving cover. The others will be coming." He was right. As the covering fire continued, she saw two more figures break from the main group and sprint toward the west, towards the narrow pass, towards the rockfall she was supposed to trigger. They were trying to flank them. "Lucinda, go!" Dusan yelled, already loosing another arrow at the men on the trail below. Now! Her mind froze for a second. The rifle, the men, the trap. It was all happening too fast. But Dusan's command, sharp and absolute, broke through her panic. She scrambled away from the ledge, grabbing the heavy iron crowbar as she ran. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she raced toward the crevice. She could hear the men below, their boots scraping on the rock as they climbed. They were moving fast. She reached the top of the pass, her breath coming in ragged sobs. Below her in the narrow channel, she could see them. Two men climbing frantically, their faces pale in the moonlight. They were almost at the top. She had seconds. She jammed the end of the crowbar under the key log, the one holding back a ton of rock and death. She put all her weight on it, gritting her teeth. The log groaned, but it didn't move. It was wedged too tightly. The men were closer now, their labored breathing audible. One of them looked up and saw her. His eyes widened in a brief moment of shocked understanding. "Get her!" he yelled. Panic gave her a surge of adrenaline. She screamed a raw, primal sound and threw her entire body against the crowbar. The log shifted. A trickle of pebbles rained down. The men below hesitated, looking up in terror. With another desperate heave, the log popped free. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then with a deep, grinding groan that seemed to come from the very bones of the mountain, the massive chalk stone shifted. It tilted, slowly at first, and then it fell. It didn't just fall. It descended, a block of pure, unstoppable gravity, scraping and shattering against the narrow walls of the crevice, taking an avalanche of smaller rocks and scree with it. The men's screams were swallowed by the thunderous roar of the rockfall. The ground shook, and the air filled with a choking cloud of red dust. And then, as quickly as it began, it was over. The pass was gone, filled with a tomb of shattered rock. There was only silence. Lucinda fell back, shaking violently, the crowbar clattering from her nerveless fingers. The dust settled, revealing the utter devastation. She had done it. She had unleashed the canyon's fury. The scholar from back east was gone, buried under a ton of rock along with those two men. In her place was someone else, someone harder, someone who had looked death in the face and chosen to be the one who survived. A wave of nausea and horror washed over her, but there was no time for it. The battle for the canyon wasn't over yet. The thunder of the rockfall echoed through the canyon, a deafening proclamation of their victory on the western flank. The rifle fire from below faltered. The remaining looters, stunned by the raw, cataclysmic power they had just witnessed. In that brief, shocked silence, Dusan seized the advantage. He loosed two arrows in quick succession, forcing the men still on the goat trail to abandon their assault and scramble for cover. Lucinda stumbled back to the main ledge, her ears ringing, the smell of pulverized rock thick in her throat. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold the rifle. Dusan glanced at her, his eyes unreadable in the moonlight. He saw the horror on her face, the tremor in her hands. He didn't offer comfort. He simply pointed toward the canyon floor. "It's not over," he said, his voice grim. Silas was enraged. His plan was in shambles. 4 of his men taken out by a ghost with a bow and a rock trap that shouldn't have been possible. Lucinda could hear him shouting, his voice a raw fury. ordering his last remaining man to provide covering fire while he did something desperate. He wasn't retreating. He was doubling down. "What's he doing?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Something stupid," Dusan muttered, knocking another arrow. Silas did something no one expected. He ran. He broke cover and sprinted directly for the goat trail, firing his own rifle wildly up at their position as he came. It wasn't an assault. It was a suicide run. He was using himself as a distraction, drawing all their fire, while his last man circled around looking for an angle. "Don't shoot at him," Deucin commanded. "He wants us to. Watch for the other one." But it was too late. Lucinda, her nerves frayed, raised the rifle and fired. The shot went wide, kicking up dust far to Silas's left. It was the mistake they'd been waiting for. The moment her rifle flashed, the last looter, who had crawled into a position on a rocky outcrop to their right, opened fire. A bullet slammed into the rock right next to Dusan's head, sending stone fragments flying. He flinched back, momentarily blinded. Another bullet whined past Lucinda's ear. They were pinned from two directions. Silas was halfway up the trail, climbing with a reckless speed, his face a mask of murderous determination. They were out of time, out of options. Then from high above them came the whistle of Tommy's sling. A rock, small but thrown with all the boy's strength, sailed through the air. It didn't hit Silas. It hit the rock face above him. It was a small sound, but it caused Silas to do exactly what Deucin had predicted. He looked up. In that split second of distraction, Deucin recovered. He ignored the rifleman on the right and focused on the immediate threat. He rose, exposed himself to fire for a dangerous second, and drew his bow. The string sang its deadly song one last time. The arrow took Silas in the shoulder. The impact spun him around, his rifle clattering down the rocks. He screamed in pain and rage, his fingers clawing at the arrow shaft, but his grip on the rock failed. He tumbled backward, falling 10 feet before landing in a broken heap on a lower ledge, motionless. The last looter, seeing his leader fall, let out a cry of despair. He fired one last wild shot into the darkness and then scrambled away, melting into the shadows of the canyon, a coward running for his life. Silence fell. A deep, profound silence, broken only by the ragged sound of their own breathing and the soft whisper of the wind. It was over. The ground below was littered with the consequences of Silas's greed, but the hollow was safe. They had held it. They had won. Deucin slowly lowered his bow, his entire body slumping with exhaustion. He turned to Lucinda, and in the pale moonlight, she saw the terrible cost of the battle in his eyes. He looked at the rifle in her hands, then at her face. "You did not run," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, filled with a weight she couldn't yet comprehend. Tommy scrambled down from his perch, his face pale but his eyes shining with a strange, fierce light. He ran to Deucin, not to Lucinda. "Did we get them? Did we win?" Deucin placed a hand on the boy's head, a gesture of profound tenderness. "We survived," he said quietly. "Tonight, that is the same thing as winning." He looked over Tommy's head at Lucinda, and a silent understanding passed between them. They were no longer just allies of convenience. They were survivors of the same fire, bound by the blood and violence of the night. The canyon, which had roared with the fury of rock and gunfire, was now quiet, watching them with its ancient, silent patience. They had paid its price in blood and terror, and in return, it had given them their lives. Lucinda looked out from the ledge, at the broken bodies below, and the vast, indifferent stars above. The woman who had arrived in this canyon, seeking a dead man's gold, was truly gone. She didn't know who she was now, but she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she was home. In the first light of dawn, the canyon was serene, its red rock washed in the soft, clean colors of a new day. It was impossible to believe that only hours before it had been a battlefield. The silence was broken only by the cry of a hawk circling high overhead. There were no victory celebrations, no words of triumph. There was only a heavy shared exhaustion and the grim work that needed to be done. Deucin, moving with a weary stiffness, descended into the canyon. Lucinda watched him, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. She didn't know what he was doing, and she didn't ask. It was his canyon, his ritual. Tommy stayed close to her, his bravado from the night before replaced by a quiet, somber mood. The reality of what had happened, of what they had done, was settling in. When Deucin returned hours later, his face was a stoic mask, but his eyes were filled with a deep, ancient sorrow. He carried Silas's rifle and the dead men's canteens. He said nothing of what he had done, and they did not ask. The canyon kept its secrets. They spent the day in a state of quiet shock. Lucinda tended to the gash on Dusan's arm, which he now allowed her to do without protest. The simple act of cleaning the wound and applying a fresh bandage was an anchor, a small, sane task in a world that had gone mad. As she worked, her fingers brushing against his skin, a current passed between them, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had been forged in the crucible of violence. Late in the afternoon, Dusan finally spoke. He took the fractured piece of painted stone, the one that had started it all, from his pack. He held it out for her to see. The symbol of the spiral with the 3 lines glowed faintly in the sunlight. "You wanted to know the truth," he said, his voice low and raspy. "My grandfather told me this story. The Spanish did come here, centuries ago. They were searching for the 7 cities of gold. They found my people instead. They brought guns and disease, and they tried to enslave us. But my ancestors fought back. They were not warriors, but they knew this land. They led the Spanish deep into the canyons, into a trap." He paused, his gaze distant. There was no gold mine. The story of the treasure was a lie, a lure created by my ancestors to lead their enemies to their doom. The spiral is not a map to a mine. It marks a place of great sorrow. It marks a tomb. He had not just been protecting rock paintings. He had been guarding the sanctity of a grave, a memorial to a massacre his people had suffered and a victory they had won. The truth was so much bigger and more tragic than her father's selfish fantasy. All his life he had been chasing a lie, a ghost story designed to kill men just like him. All her life she had been honoring the memory of a fool. The realization was devastating, but it was also liberating. The weight of her father's obsession, a burden she had carried for years, finally lifted. "The real treasure of this canyon," Dusan continued, his voice barely a whisper, "is the water, the life, the stories that teach us how to live in it with respect. Silas and his kind would have destroyed it all for a lie. Your father was blinded by it, but you—" He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "You saw the truth." "I helped you," she said softly. "You fought for it," he corrected her. "You fought for this place. That makes you a part of its story now, whether you want to be or not." That evening, as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, a sense of peace, fragile but real, settled over the hollow. The ghost had been exorcised, both hers and his. They sat by the fire, Tommy asleep between them, the silence comfortable, complete. "You have a choice now," Dusan said, looking into the flames. "The last of Silas's men is long gone. The trail to Ash Fork is safe. You can take the boy and go back east. You can go home." Lucinda looked around the hollow, at the towering walls of red rock that had protected them, at the star-filled sky that was bigger and clearer than any she had ever seen. She thought of the stifling parlors of Boston, of the life of quiet desperation she had fled. That was not her home, not anymore. "What if I am home?" she asked quietly. Dusan looked at her, and for the first time a genuine, unguarded smile touched his lips. It transformed his face, erasing the lines of weariness and sorrow. "This is a hard land," he warned. "It does not give its heart easily." "I'm a fast learner," she replied, her own smile answering his. He reached across the small space between them and took her hand. His hand was rough and calloused, but his touch was gentle. It wasn't a gesture of passion, but of partnership, of acceptance. "Then we have many stories to learn together," he said. They sat there for a long time, their hands clasped, watching the fire dance. The hawk's cry was gone, replaced by the soft hoot of an owl. The canyon, having tested them and found them worthy, wrapped them in its vast, silent embrace. Lucinda had come to Arizona seeking a story, and she had found one. It wasn't the one she expected, but it was real, written not in gold, but in dust and blood and stone. And it was just beginning. Thank you for staying with me through that entire journey. It's stories like these, of courage and discovery in the face of impossible odds, that remind us what we're capable of. If this story touched your heart, I'd be so grateful if you'd hit that like button and consider subscribing to the channel. Your support is what allows me to keep finding and sharing these incredible tales with all of you. Until next time, stay safe and never stop listening to the stories the world wants to tell you.